They laughed, they mocked. They thought he was just a helpless old man. But when he took off his coat, silence filled the room. Those symbols, those marks, meant something much greater than anyone there could imagine. And when they finally heard his name, they realized they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Who was he? And why did his presence make the gangsters tremble? Stay until the end, because this story has an amazing twist. The clinking of cups and the murmur of conversations filled the small Golden Corner cafe in the Chinatown district of San Francisco. Among the worn wooden tables and the aroma of freshly ground coffee, Don William Foster sat alone in the furthest corner of the establishment. His perfectly pressed grey suit contrasted with the informality of the place, but he seemed not to notice as he enjoyed his black coffee without sugar, as he had every afternoon for the past 3 months. At 65, Don William projected a silent dignity. His completely white hair was combed back with military precision, and his hands, though marked by time, remained steady as he held the porcelain cup. His eyes, a deep brown, seemed to observe beyond the obvious, as if constantly evaluating his surroundings. The doorbell rang loudly when a group of 5 young men entered noisily. They wore typical urban attire, baggy jeans, t-shirts with flashy prints, and backward caps. Their strident laughter broke the calm atmosphere of the cafe, as they settled at a central table, banging chairs and talking loudly. "Mrs. Lucy, some sodas for the kings of the neighborhood," shouted the one who appeared to be the leader, a young man of about 20 with a thin scar on his left eyebrow. His name was Jack Miller, but everyone in the neighborhood knew him as Scarface. The elderly proprietor of the establishment, Mrs. Lucy, a short woman with grey hair pulled back in a bun, frowned but approached to serve them. It wasn't the first time these boys had caused problems, but she needed the business and preferred to keep them happy. I'm coming, but lower the volume because you're scaring away the customers," she responded firmly, but without hostility. The group continued laughing and strutting. Among them stood out Richard Vance, the youngest, barely 18, who had been dragged into this circle more out of admiration than genuine affinity. His eyes moved nervously around the place, as if seeking approval from the other customers. It was then that Jack noticed Don William's presence. The contrast between his elegance and the simplicity of the place was too obvious to ignore. "Look who honors us with his presence," said Jack loudly enough for everyone to hear. "A dinosaur escaped from the museum." His companions burst into laughter. Richard laughed too, but his laughter sounded forced, uncomfortable. Don William didn't even raise his gaze from his cup. He continued drinking with the same imperturbable calm, as if the words hadn't reached his ears. "What's wrong, Grandpa? Can't you hear us, or do we not have the honor of deserving your attention?" insisted Jack, encouraged by the laughter of his companions. Mrs. Lucy, from behind the counter, began to move uncomfortably. She had known Don William since he had begun frequenting her cafe, always polite, always generous with tips, never causing problems. He didn't deserve this kind of treatment. "Boys, better consume and leave him in peace," intervened the elderly woman, but her voice was lost among the new laughter. Jack, emboldened by Don William's apparent passivity, stood up and approached his table. He leaned over, placing both hands on the wooden surface, deliberately invading the older man's personal space. "You know what, Mr. Nobody? This is our territory. We rule here. People like you should stay in your mansions in Pacific Heights, not come to dirty your shoes in our streets." It was then that Don William finally raised his gaze. His eyes, which had previously seemed distant, now bored into Jack's with an intensity that made the young man unconsciously take a small step back. "You don't know what you're doing," said Don William in a serene but firm voice, almost like a whisper which paradoxically seemed more threatening than any shout. For an instant, an uncomfortable silence seized the place. Even the other customers stopped talking, feeling the tension that had settled among the tables. "We don't know what we're doing," repeated Jack, regaining his composure and forcing a mocking smile. "Of course we know. We own these streets. You're the one who doesn't know where you've gotten yourself into, Grandpa." Don William sighed, as if he were genuinely tired of the situation. With deliberately slow movements, he began to take off his suit jacket. The gesture, so out of place, provoked more laughter among the young men. "Look at this. Is he going to fight us? Or maybe he's going to show us his medals from the Korean War?" joked another of the boys, Henry Sullivan, a muscular young man with a tribal tattoo peeking out from the collar of his t-shirt. But Henry's laughter died on his lips when Don William finished removing his jacket, revealing his arms beneath his white shirt. As he slightly rolled up his sleeves, there came into view ancient tattoos, intricate and of a complexity that spoke of deep and dangerous meanings. They were symbols that anyone in the world of the streets would recognize, marks of respect, of power, of a past that not just anyone could boast of. Jack's face visibly paled. His gaze fixed on one of the tattoos in particular, an eagle devouring a serpent, surrounded by tribal symbols and marks that only the initiated would understand. "No, it can't be," he murmured, his voice now devoid of all the previous arrogance. Richard, the youngest, looked confused between Jack and Don William, not completely understanding what was happening, but feeling the dramatic change in the atmosphere. "Don." William snapped his fingers once, a simple gesture but loaded with authority. "My name," he said pausingly, "was feared for a long time, but that's behind me." He put his jacket back on with the same calm with which he had taken it off. "You're lucky I'm no longer who I was before." The entire cafe was plunged into absolute silence. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. It was as if time had stopped in that small establishment in Chinatown. With unhurried movements, Don William finished his coffee, left a high-denomination bill on the table, much more than his consumption, cost, and stood up. As he passed by the table of young men, none dared to look him directly in the eyes. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Lucy." He said goodbye with a nod toward the proprietor, who responded with a similar gesture, mixed with an expression of astonishment and newly discovered reverence. When the door closed behind him, the group of young men seemed to deflate like punctured balloons. Jack dropped into a chair, his face still pale. "Who was that gentleman?" asked Richard, with a mixture of confusion and fear. Jack shook his head, as if he couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. "We just insulted William the Eagle Foster," he responded almost in a whisper. "And who is that?" insisted Richard. "Someone you never want to mess with," responded Henry, passing a trembling hand over his face. "We were saved by pure luck." Outside, under the golden light of the San Francisco afternoon, Don William adjusted his jacket and continued his way through the streets of Chinatown. His face had returned to that serene, almost expressionless look, while the memories of a previous life seemed to whisper in his ear with each step he took. In his apartment, located in a discreet but elegant building near Golden Gate Park, a framed photograph awaited him on the bedside table. A younger man, with the same dignified bearing but a fierce look, surrounded by men who looked at him with respect and fear. And next to him, a beautiful woman with black hair and a sweet smile holding a small girl. Don William had left that world behind, but the world was not always willing to forget him. The next morning dawned with a clear sky over San Francisco. In his apartment, Don William performed his usual routine with methodical precision. He got up at 6 o'clock sharp, did 50 push-ups and 50 sit-ups, as he had done for the last 30 years no matter where he was. Then he showered with cold water, shaved carefully, and dressed in another of his impeccable suits, this time navy blue. While preparing his breakfast, scrambled eggs with a side of vegetables and a cup of black coffee, his gaze drifted to the photograph he had contemplated the night before. He took it in his hands, gently passing his fingers over the woman's face. 20 years, Mary," he murmured, "and I still miss you every day." The doorbell of the apartment rang, pulling him from his thoughts. Don William frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors, and the only people who knew where he lived were the building manager and his only daughter, Catherine, who resided in Boston and only visited him on special occasions. With caution learned from previous years, he approached the door and looked through the peephole. To his surprise, it was Richard, the youngest from the group at the cafe. He was alone, visibly nervous, constantly looking at both sides of the hallway. Don William opened the door, maintaining a neutral expression. "Good morning, young man," he greeted formally. "Can I help you with something?" Richard swallowed, clearly intimidated by the presence of the older man, despite the fact that he showed no sign of hostility. "Don William, I wanted to apologize for yesterday," he began, the words stumbling in his mouth. "I didn't know who you were. I really don't know who you are, but the others. Jack and Henry were very scared and—" "How did you find my address?" interrupted Don William, his voice calm but firm. Richard paled even more. "My uncle is a police officer," he confessed. "I asked him to look up your name. I know it was wrong, but I needed to talk to you." Don William observed him for a few seconds, evaluating the sincerity in his eyes. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come in. I just made coffee." Don William's apartment was orderly and austere, with furniture of good quality but without ostentation. The walls were decorated with some paintings of American landscapes and framed photographs of different places in the country. There were no signs of excessive luxury, but of refined taste. Richard sat uncomfortably on the edge of the sofa, while Don William served him a cup of coffee. "Sugar?" he asked. "2 spoonfuls, please," responded Richard, surprised by the hospitality of the man they had insulted the day before. "So," said Don William, sitting across from him with his own cup, "what really brings you here, young man?" Richard looked at his coffee, gathering courage. "My older brother, Gabriel, he's in trouble," he began. "A few months ago, he started working for a man named Sebastian Owens. At first, they were just small jobs, deliveries and errands, but now—" Don William tensed visibly upon hearing the name. "Sebastian Owens, are you sure of that name?" Richard nodded. "Yes, everyone knows him as the Shark. He controls most of the businesses in the Marina district, and now he's expanding toward Chinatown. Jack and the others work for him indirectly. I just follow them because I'm afraid to be alone in the neighborhood." Don William put his cup on the table and stood up, walking to the window. His mind worked quickly, connecting dots that had remained scattered for years. "Sebastian Owens," he repeated, more to himself than to Richard. 20 years ago, he was just an ambitious young man. He worked for me as a messenger." He turned to Richard, who was looking at him with a mixture of amazement and fear. "What kind of trouble does your brother have exactly?" "Gabriel wants to get out," explained Richard. "He discovered that Owens is involved in things, worse than he thought. But when he tried to distance himself, they threatened him. They said that if he didn't continue working for them, our family would suffer the consequences." Don William nodded slowly, perfectly understanding the situation. It was a pattern he had seen hundreds of times in his previous life. "And why? Do you come to me? What do you expect me to do?" Richard looked him directly in the eyes for the first time. "Jack said you were the only one who could stand up to Owens. He said you used to be someone important." Don William passed a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the years and past decisions. "What I was no longer exists," he responded, firmly. "It's been 20 years since I left that life behind." "Please," insisted Richard, standing up. "My brother is desperate. Our mother is sick, and Gabriel is the only one who supports her. We have no one else to turn to." Don William observed the young man, remembering other boys like him, trapped in circles of violence and dangerous loyalties. He thought of his own daughter, Catherine, and how he had promised on Mary's grave that he would never return to that world that had caused them so much harm. "I'm sorry, Richard," he said finally. "I can't help you, not in the way you think." The disappointment on the young man's face was evident, but Don William continued. "However, I can give you advice, and some money so your brother and you can leave the city for a while." Richard shook his head. "We can't leave. Our mother needs regular medical treatment here. And even if we left, Owens would find us. He has contacts everywhere." Don William knew the boy was right. Men like Sebastian Owens didn't leave loose ends. "Give me a few days," he said finally. "I don't promise anything, but I'll see what I can find out about Owens's current situation." Richard's face lit up with hope. "Really? Thank you, Don William, really." "Don't thank me yet," he interrupted. "I'm just gathering information, and this stays between us. Don't mention to anyone that you've come to see me, understood?" Richard nodded vigorously. I promise." After the young man left, Don William remained for a long time at the window, observing the bustle of the city. The mention of Sebastian Owens had awakened memories he believed buried. Owens had been one of his protégés, a clever young man with ambition, but also with a cruel streak that Don William had always kept under control. With a sigh, he headed to his bedroom. Under the bed was a safe embedded in the floor. He opened it with a combination he hadn't used in years. Inside, besides important documents and some money, there was an old mobile phone and a small address book. Don William took both objects and observed them carefully. The phone probably wouldn't work anymore, but the numbers in the book, many of them would surely still be useful. People who owed him favors, old contacts who respected the unwritten code of the world in which he once moved. Just information, he told himself, nothing more than that. But deep down he knew he was taking the first step on a dangerous path, a path he had sworn never to walk again. That afternoon, instead of going to the cafe as was his custom, Don William headed toward an old bar in the North Beach district. The Golden Rooster had been, 20 years ago, one of his favorite meeting places. He didn't know if it would still exist or if its former owner, Thomas the Rooster Rodriguez, would still be alive. To his surprise, the bar not only existed but seemed to have changed very little. The same discreet facade, the same half-closed blinds to keep the interior in semi-darkness, even the same neon sign, though now it flickered irregularly. Upon entering, the familiar aroma of old wood, tobacco, and whiskey enveloped him like an old embrace. The place was almost empty, except for a couple of men at the bar and a group playing dominoes at a table in the back. Behind the bar, a man of about 70 was cleaning glasses with a cloth. His face, marked by deep wrinkles, lit up with a mixture of amazement and joy upon seeing Don William. "Well, I'll be damned," exclaimed Thomas. "Is it really Don William the Eagle Foster in the flesh?" Don William smiled slightly. "It's been a long time, old friend." Thomas came out from behind the bar with surprising agility for his age and hugged Don William tightly. 20 years, compadre. 20 long years. Many said you were, well, that you were no longer among us." "Sometimes I think so myself," responded Don William, returning the embrace. Thomas led him to a secluded table, in a corner from where they could see the entire entrance. An old habit that neither of them seemed to have lost. "A whiskey," offered Thomas. "Like in the old days," accepted Don William. While Thomas went for the drinks, Don William observed the bar in more detail. The photographs on the walls showed Thomas with various characters throughout the years. In one of them, almost hidden among others, Don William himself could be seen, much younger, along with Thomas and 3 other men, all smiling at the camera with the confidence of those who know themselves to be untouchable. "I still keep it," said Thomas, returning with 2 glasses and a bottle. "It's a good memory of better times." "Better?" asked Don William, accepting the glass offered to him. "Different, at least," responded Thomas, sitting across from him. "Back then there were codes, respect. The young people nowadays," he shook his head, "they have no honor." They drank in silence for a moment, both lost in memories. "You didn't come for nostalgia, did you, Eagle?" finally asked Thomas. William looked at him directly. "Sebastian Owens." The name seemed to darken Thomas's face. "That bastard," he murmured. "He's been growing a lot in recent years. Since the old bosses like you retired or disappeared, people like him have taken control." "How big is his operation?" Thomas leaned forward, lowering his voice. "He controls almost all the west of the city and is expanding toward the south. He has politicians, police officers, and judges in his pocket. And he's ruthless, William. Not like us in our time. He respects nothing and no one." Don William nodded, processing the information. "Do you know if he has any weak points? Family? Places he frequents?" Thomas looked at him with suspicion. "Why do you want to know that, compadre? I thought you had left all that world behind." "I'm just gathering information," responded Don William, repeating what he had told Richard, "for precaution." "Well, be very careful," warned Thomas. "Owens is not like the rivals we faced in the past. He's different, colder, more calculating." "I remember him well," said Don William. I trained him myself, after all. Thomas sighed deeply. And that was perhaps your only mistake, Eagle. You raised a shark, and now he's devouring everything in his path. Don William finished his whiskey in a single swallow, feeling the familiar burn in his throat. I need your help, old friend. I need to know everything you can tell me about him, and I need to contact some of the old ones. Thomas looked at him with concern. Are you sure of what you're doing? Remember what happened to Mary when you tried to get out? Don William raised a hand, interrupting him. Don't mention my wife, he said, his voice suddenly hard. Just give me the information. I need. Thomas nodded slowly. All right, compadre, for old time's sake. But I warn you, you're stirring up a hornet's nest. And if Owens discovers that you're asking questions about him, let him discover it, responded Don William, a spark of his former ferocity momentarily shining in his eyes. Perhaps it's time for the student to remember who was his teacher. At that moment, while the two old friends continued their conversation, outside the bar, a black car stopped slowly. Inside, a young man in an elegant suit observed, so the entrance with interest while talking on the phone. Yes, boss, I just saw him enter. It's him, definitely. Yes, Don William the Eagle Foster in person. Do you want me to follow him when he leaves? Understood, just watch for now. I'll inform you of any movement. The man hung up, lit a cigarette, and prepared for a long wait. News traveled fast in San Francisco, especially when it involved legends returning from the shadows. The call came at 3 in the morning, waking Don William from a restless sleep. Barely a day had passed since his visit to the Golden Rooster, and already he felt events precipitating around him like an avalanche he couldn't stop. Hello? He answered, immediately alert despite the hour. Don William! The voice on the other end sounded agitated, almost breathless. It was Richard. I'm sorry for calling so late, but it's Gabriel, my brother. He's in the hospital. They beat him really badly. They say it was a message from Owens. Don William sat up, passing a hand over his face. Which hospital? Chinatown General. I didn't know who else to call. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't talk to anyone else about this. He dressed quickly, not in one of his usual formal suits, but in more casual clothes. Dark jeans, a black shirt, and a leather jacket that had remained years at the bottom of his closet. Looking at himself in the mirror for an instant, he saw reflected the image of the man he had been 2 decades ago. Just for tonight, he murmured to his reflection. Before leaving, he opened the drawer of his bedside table and extracted a small metal box. Inside was a silver rosary, a gift from Mary on their last anniversary together. He put it in his pocket, as he had always done in dangerous times. The hospital was in semi-darkness when he arrived, with the reduced activity typical of the early morning hours. In the waiting room, he found Richard, sitting with his head in his hands. Next to him, an older woman of fragile appearance was sobbing silently. Mrs. Hope, the mother of the boys, Don William supposed. Richard, he called softly. The young man looked up, his eyes reddened from tears and fatigue. Don William, thank you for coming. He stood up shakily. The older woman also looked up, confused by the presence of this elegant stranger with a distinguished bearing in the midst of her personal tragedy. Mom, this is Don William Foster, explained Richard. He's a friend who can help us. Don William respectfully inclined his head. I'm very sorry about your son, Mom. How is he? The doctors say he'll recover, she responded with a trembling voice, but he has 3 fractured ribs, a broken arm and his face. She couldn't continue, tears choking her words. Don William nodded gravely. May I see him? He's sedated, intervened Richard, but we can go to his room. The doctors said he'll wake up in a few hours. The room was shared with 2 other patients, but Gabriel occupied the bed furthest from the door. Even in the semi-darkness, Don William could appreciate the brutality of the attack. The young man's face was unrecognizable, swollen and bruised, with bandages covering most of it. His right arm was in a cast and elevated, while multiple tubes and cables connected him to machines that emitted constant beeps. Don William remained silent for several minutes, observing the injured young man. In his long life he had seen worse things, much worse, but it had been a long time since violence had touched his world so directly. An old rage began to boil inside him, a feeling he thought forgotten. "Who exactly did this?" he asked, his voice controlled but with an edge that Richard had never heard before. "They were Owens's men," responded the young man. "4 of them intercepted Gabriel when he was leaving work. They told him it was a message, so he would understand that no one quits working for the shark." Don William nodded slowly. "I need you to tell me everything you know about your brother's operation. Places, names, routes, everything." Richard looked nervously toward his mother, who had sat next to Gabriel's bed and was gently caressing his uninjured hand. "We can talk outside," he suggested. In the deserted hospital hallway, Richard told him everything he knew. Gabriel had begun as a messenger for Owens, transporting packages that he should never open. Gradually, his responsibilities increased until he became one of those in charge of collecting protection fees from merchants in various areas of Chinatown. It was then that he discovered that those who didn't pay suffered brutal consequences. When Gabriel saw what they did to the owner of the bakery for being late on a payment, he decided he wanted out, explained Richard. But Owens told him that nobody leaves his organization, that once inside there's only one way to leave. Don William mentally completed the phrase that Richard didn't dare to pronounce. In the world of men like Owens, the only exit was horizontal and 6 feet under. "And the boys from the cafe, Jack and the others?" "They're recruiters," responded Richard. "They look for young people from the neighborhood to gradually incorporate them. I was on the list of the next ones." Don William processed all this information in silence. The modus operandi hadn't changed much in 20 years, although the methods seemed to have become more ruthless, less subtle. "Do you and your mother have somewhere to stay?" he finally asked. "A safe place, away from here, with relatives perhaps?" Richard shook his head. "We don't have anyone else in the city, and my mother won't leave Gabriel alone in the hospital." Don William took a wad of bills from his pocket and handed it to Richard. "When Gabriel can be transferred, take him to this address," he added, giving him a card with the name of a private clinic in Nob Hill. "Ask for Dr. Vargas and tell him you come from me. I'll take care of talking to him." Richard looked at the money and the card with disbelief. "Don William, we can't accept this. It's too much, and we barely know you." "You can and you will," interrupted Don William firmly. "You came to me for help, and this is what I can offer for now. Besides, this situation is partly my responsibility." "Your responsibility? I don't understand." "Sebastian Owens was my protégé many years ago," explained Don William, his gaze lost in distant memories. "I trained him. I taught him the business. I made him what he is today. Perhaps if I had seen the darkness in him earlier." He stopped, aware that he was saying too much. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is that you and your family are safe. Do you promise me?" Richard nodded, still confused but deeply grateful. "I promise, but what are you going to do?" An enigmatic smile, almost imperceptible, crossed Don William's face. "I'm going to have a conversation with some old friends." Before Richard could ask more, Don William's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Hello? Eagle?" said a familiar voice he hadn't heard in years. "Is it true that you've returned to fly?" "Xavier," responded Don William immediately, recognizing Xavier the Falcon Mitchell, former ally and one of the few who had survived the territorial wars of those years. "News flies fast." "In this business it always has," responded Xavier. "Thomas told me you're asking questions about the shark. It's not wise to stir those waters, old friend." "I'm not looking for trouble, Xavier, just information." A brief silence extended on the line before Xavier responded, "Union Square, the Cantina, the Crazy Mariachi, midnight, come alone." The call was cut before Don William could respond. "Who was that?" asked Richard, noticing the change in Don William's expression. "A ghost from the past," he responded. "Return to your mother and Gabriel. Remember what I told you about the clinic, and don't mention to anyone about my visit here tonight." Don William left the hospital when the sky was beginning to clear on the horizon of the city. As he walked toward where he had parked his modest black sedan, he noticed a dark automobile across the street, with a man inside, apparently asleep. With the caution of years of experience, he changed his route to pass near the vehicle. The man wasn't asleep, but pretending to be, and Don William immediately recognized the profile: Michael the Shadow Davis, former hitman who had worked for several bosses over the years, always at the service of the highest bidder. Instead of being alarmed, Don William smiled to himself. If Owens had put the Shadow to watch him, it meant he was nervous, and a nervous man makes mistakes. Instead of heading to his apartment, he drove to an old motel on the outskirts of the city, one of the many safe places he had established in his days of power and that few knew about. He needed to rest and plan before his meeting in Union Square. The Pine Trees Motel had seen better days, but it was still discreet, and the owner, an elderly man named Roger, recognized him immediately. "Don William," he greeted with a mixture of surprise and respect. "It's been a long time." "Too long, Roger. I need room 12 if it's available." The old man smiled, revealing several gold teeth. "For you, it always is." The room was austere but clean. Don William closed the curtains, checked that the old safe behind the picture of the Virgin Mary was still intact, and lay down on the bed, finally allowing himself to close his eyes. His last thought before falling asleep was for Catherine, his daughter. If she knew he was getting involved again in that world he had fought so hard to leave behind. But some debts must be paid, and some mistakes can only be corrected by returning to the place where they began. At 11 o'clock at night, Don William awoke, as alert as if he had slept a full night. He showered quickly and dressed in the same clothes as the night before. From the safe, he extracted a small gun that he had hidden there years ago, verified that it still worked, and placed it in a holster concealed under his jacket. Union Square was the heart of traditional San Francisco, famous for its street musicians and bars. At midnight, it still bustled with activity, with tourists and locals enjoying the music and the drinks. The Crazy Mariachi was one of the oldest bars in the square, known for its exclusively American clientele and its authentic atmosphere. Upon entering, Don William was greeted by the din of a band playing King of the Road. The place was packed, but at a table in the back, almost hidden behind a column, a man of about 60 was drinking whiskey alone. Don William recognized him instantly: Xavier Mitchell, the Falcon, former rival and later ally in the territorial wars of the 90s. "Eagle," greeted Xavier when Don William sat across from him. "The years have been kind to you." "I can't say the E." "Same," responded Don William with a half-smile. Xavier had aged notably, his face full of scars and deep wrinkles, and a black patch covered his left eye, the result of a particularly violent confrontation from the past. "Life outside the business must be healthier," laughed Xavier, pouring him a whiskey. "Although I never thought you'd really retire after what happened to Mary. We all thought you'd return for revenge, not to disappear." Don William took the glass, but didn't drink. "Things change, Xavier. Priorities, too." "And what are your priorities? Now, old friend? Why wake the past after so long?" Don William looked at him directly, evaluating how much he could trust this man who had been ally and enemy at different times. "Sebastian Owens is causing problems," he said finally. "Problems that affect me indirectly." Xavier nodded slowly. "The Shark, I always knew that boy would be a problem. He had ambition, but he lacked your finesse, your code. I need to know everything about his current operation: weaknesses, routines, allies, enemies." The Falcon drank his whiskey and poured himself another, studying Don William with his one eye. "For what exactly? Do you plan to retake your old territory?" "No," responded Don William firmly. "I just want to resolve a pending matter. Afterwards, I'll return to my retirement." Xavier laughed with disbelief. "Nobody really comes back, Eagle. Once you enter these waters again, the current drags you." "I will," insisted Don William. "I have a daughter, Xavier. A different life now." The Falcon seemed to consider this. Finally, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Owens has grown more than you imagine. His operation covers almost half the city. He has judges, politicians, and high-ranking police officers on his payroll, but he made a significant pause. He's not invulnerable. Continue, urged Don William. He's created enemies. Many. His style, brutal, has broken old alliances. The Vargas brothers in the Tenderloin, the Rojas family in the Mission District, even the Foxes of Oakland, all would be willing to see the shark fall. Don William processed this information. The names mentioned were powerful organizations, some of which had been his allies in the past. And you, Xavier? Where are you on this board? The Falcon smiled enigmatically. Let's say I maintain cordial relations with all parties. At my age, it's the only way to survive. Cordial enough to arrange some meetings? Depends on who you want to see, responded Xavier cautiously. The Vargases, to start. The Falcon reclined in his chair, evaluating the request. It could be arranged, but it will cost you. Money has never been a problem, responded Don William. I'm not talking about money, Eagle. I'm talking about favors. If you return to the game, even temporarily, you'll have to take sides eventually. Don William knew Xavier was right. In his world, neutrality was a luxury that few could afford, and never for long. One bridge at a time, old friend, he said finally. First the Vargases, then we'll see. Xavier nodded, apparently satisfied. I'll contact you tomorrow with the details. Meanwhile, be careful. The shark already knows you're asking questions, and he's not the type of man who waits to see what happens. He never was, agreed Don William, remembering the ambitious young man he had taken under his wing 2 decades ago. But neither am I. Before the conversation could continue, the door of the bar opened and 3 threatening-looking men entered. Don William recognized them instantly as the type of muscle that Owens used to employ. Large, dangerous, and not particularly intelligent. Looks like the party is about to begin, murmured Xavier, his hand sliding discreetly under the table. Not here, said Don William, standing up calmly. There are too many civilians. Any other exit? He asked, already knowing the answer was negative. The Crazy Mariachi was famous for having only one entrance, which made it perfect for meetings where surprises weren't wanted, but problematic in situations like this. Let's improvise, responded Don William, heading toward the bar with a determined but unhurried step. Xavier followed him, keeping an eye on the 3 men who now scanned the place, clearly looking for them. The scene seemed frozen in time, the band playing cheerfully, while 2 old warriors prepared for a confrontation that could end in many ways, none of them good. Don William felt the familiar discharge of adrenaline, the world slowing down around him, each detail becoming sharper. Despite the years, his body perfectly remembered what to do in moments like this. Like in the old days, huh, Eagle? Murmured Xavier, a tense smile on his face marked by scars. Let's hope not, responded Don William, just as the largest of the 3 men recognized him and began to make his way toward them through the crowd. The deafening noise of the music inside the Crazy Mariachi contrasted with the silent tension that had settled between Don William and the 3 men who were advancing toward them. The most corpulent, with a scar that crossed his right cheek, pushed without consideration the tourists who stood in his way. Any brilliant ideas, murmured Xavier, whose good eye didn't miss a detail of the thug's movements. Don William quickly scanned the place. His mind, accustomed for decades to calculating risks and exits, worked at full speed. When I give you the signal, throw the table in the corner. I'll take care of the rest. A group of American tourists, completely oblivious to the situation, approached the band requesting Sweet Home Alabama at the top of their lungs. The band began to play enthusiastically, while the bar filled with applause and celebratory shouts. Don William took advantage of the momentary confusion to move strategically toward the bar. With an almost imperceptible gesture to Xavier, he gave the signal. The Falcon acted with the quickness of someone who had spent his life in dangerous situations. With one swipe, he overturned a table full of drinks that fell noisily in the direction of the 3 men. The bottles crashed against the floor, glass and whiskey splashing in all directions. The tourists, believing it was part of the celebration, cheered even louder. The leader of the thugs slipped on the spilled liquid and fell heavily, cursing. As he tried to get up, Don William, taking advantage of the confusion, approached the bartender, an older man with a graying mustache who looked at him with recognition in his eyes. "Don William," said the bartender, surprised. "It's been a long time." "Too long, Ray," responded Don William without losing sight of the men who were now reorganizing. "I need the back exit, now." Ray nodded without asking questions. In the circles in which they moved, loyalty to figures like Don William was almost religious. He lifted a section of the bar and indicated for them to pass quickly. "Through the kitchen, the green door," he instructed, as Don William and Xavier slipped behind the bar. They crossed the kitchen amid the surprised looks of the cooks and went out through the indicated door to a narrow and poorly lit alley. The cool night air contrasted with the charged atmosphere of the interior. "That was close," commented Xavier, catching his breath. "You haven't lost your touch, Eagle." "Basic preservation," responded Don William, adjusting his jacket. "But this complicates things. If Owens has already sent his men, it means he's more nervous than I thought." A metallic noise from the end of the alley alerted them. The door through which they had exited opened violently, and the thug with the scar appeared, followed by his two companions. "Don't move," he shouted, pulling a gun from his belt. Don William pushed Xavier toward a garbage container that provided them with some cover. "Are you armed?" he asked in a low voice. "What do you think?" responded Xavier with a tense smile, showing a small pistol he had extracted from his boot. "Don't shoot unless it's absolutely necessary," warned Don William. Attracting the police would be counterproductive. Owens's men advanced cautiously through the alley, the dim light of the moon revealing their threatening silhouettes. "We know you're there, old men," shouted the one with the scar. "Mr. Owens just wants to talk. It doesn't have to end badly." Don William and Xavier exchanged skeptical looks. Both knew perfectly well what talk meant in their world. "Distract them," whispered Don William. "I have an idea." Xavier nodded and peeked slightly from behind the container. "Boys," he shouted, "why don't you tell Sebastian to come himself? Or does he now send his errand boys to do a man's job?" The provocation had its effect. The three men concentrated their attention on Xavier's voice, giving Don William the opportunity he needed. Stealthily, he slipped between the shadows toward a fire escape that hung from one of the adjacent buildings. "Shut your mouth, old man," responded the one with the scar. "Your time is over. Now the streets belong to Mr. Owens, and he has special plans for dinosaurs like you." Xavier laughed loudly, continuing with the distraction. "Special plans? Is that what they call hiding behind brainless thugs now? In my time, real bosses showed their faces." While Xavier maintained the verbal exchange, Don William had managed to climb up the fire escape and was now moving stealthily across a balcony that overlooked the alley, right above where Owens's men were. With the agility of someone much younger, he calculated the distance and jumped on the nearest thug, knocking him down with the weight of his body. Before the others could react, he had already neutralized the man with a precise blow to the base of the skull. The other two turned, surprised by the sudden attack. The one with the scar tried to aim his weapon, but Xavier took advantage of the confusion to come out from his cover and fire into the air. "The next one goes to the knee," he warned, aiming firmly. The third man, evidently the least experienced of the group, raised his hands in sign of surrender. The one with the scar, however, maintained his defiant posture, the weapon still in his hand, evaluating his options. "Lower the weapon, boy," said Don William with a calm but authoritative voice. "There's no sense in this ending badly for everyone." For a moment, it seemed that the man was considering his words. Then, with a quick movement, he tried to aim at Don William. He didn't get to complete the gesture. With surgical precision, Xavier fired, hitting the hand that held the weapon. The impact made the gun fall to the ground while the man howled in pain, holding his bleeding hand. "I warned you," commented Xavier calmly. "Next time, listen to your elders." Don William approached the injured man, who was now on his knees, pale from pain and surprise. "You're going to give a message to Sebastian Owens," he said, leaning so that only he could hear him. "Tell him that the Eagle wants to talk. A civilized conversation on neutral ground tomorrow noon at the Museum of Modern Art." He paused, making sure the message was clear. "And tell him that if he sends more of his men instead of coming, himself, I'll take it as a personal insult, understood?" The man nodded, fear evident in his eyes. "Good, now leave." The injured thug and his companion who had surrendered picked up their unconscious colleague and retreated hastily, disappearing into the darkness of the alley. "The Museum of Modern Art?" asked Xavier when they were alone. "Seriously, William? A tourist site crowded with people?" Don William smiled slightly. "Precisely for that reason. Too many witnesses, too many cameras. Not even Owens would dare to try something there." Xavier put away his weapon and shook his head, between amused and resigned. "Always thinking 3 steps ahead, some things never change." "Let's go," said Don William, heading toward the other end of the alley. "We need to move. This place will be full of police in minutes." Indeed, sirens could already be heard in the distance approaching Union Square. They walked quickly through secondary streets until they reached a more crowded area where Xavier hailed a passing taxi. "Where should I drop you?" he asked when they were inside the vehicle. "The Fairmont Hotel," responded Don William. It was another of his old safe points, a historic hotel in Nob Hill where he had maintained a permanent suite under a false name for years. "Are you sure about this, William?" asked Xavier, as the taxi entered the night traffic of the city. "Directly confronting Owen, and it's risky even for you." Don William looked out the window, observing the lights of the city he had loved so much, and for which he had fought so much. "I have no alternative, old friend. This began 20 years ago when I took him under my protection. It's my responsibility to end it. And then what? Will you return to your quiet life as a retiree?" The question hung in the air as the taxi continued on its way. Don William didn't have a clear answer. He had firmly believed that his old life had been left behind forever, buried along with Mary. But in the last 48 hours, he had felt again the adrenaline, the respect in the eyes of others, the sensation of power that came with being who he really was, the eagle. "One thing at a time," he finally responded. "First, I need to talk to Owens. Then I'll see what follows." Xavier nodded, respecting the evasion. "I'll contact you tomorrow with the information about the Vargases. If you're going to face the shark, you'll need all the allies possible." They said goodbye in front of the elegant Art Deco building of the Fairmont Hotel, with the promise to speak the next day. In the luxurious suite, Don William poured himself a whiskey and sat by the window, contemplating the city. His phone rang, showing an unknown number. For a moment he considered not answering, but something told him he should. "Hello?" "Don William," the voice was unmistakable. "Sebastian Owens, the shark. What a pleasant surprise to know you're still alive." Don William remained calm, although the voice of his former protégé gave him an involuntary shiver. "Sebastian, I see your men have given you my message. Yes, although one of them will need surgery on his hand. You were always forceful in your methods." "I learned from the best," responded Don William, referring to his own mentor, already cold for decades. "And hi from yours," replied Owens with a soft laugh. "Regarding our meeting, the Museum of Modern Art seems unnecessarily public to me. Why don't we meet in a more intimate place?" "Because I no longer trust your definition of intimacy, Sebastian. The museum, noon, just you and me." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "What do you really want, old teacher? Why have you returned after so long?" "Tomorrow you'll know," responded Don William. "Unless you're too scared to meet face to face with the past." Another silence, longer this time. Finally, Owens spoke. "I'll be there, just me, as you ask. But I warn you, William, things have changed. I'm no longer the ambitious young man you took under your wing. Now I dictate the rules in this city." "Tomorrow we'll see if that's the case," responded Don William before hanging up. He left the phone on the table and finished his whiskey. The conversation had confirmed what he already suspected. Sebastian Owens had grown in power and influence, but also in arrogance, and arrogance was a weakness that Don William knew how to exploit. He thought of Richard and Gabriel, of Mrs. Hope, of all the families that had been affected by the shark's tyranny. He thought of his own daughter, Catherine, who had never fully understood why her father had chosen the life he had, nor why he had suddenly disappeared after the loss of her mother. With a tired sigh, Don William opened his suitcase and extracted a small, worn photograph. In it, a young Catherine, barely 10 years old, smiled alongside Mary, both with the same raven-black hair, the same deep and expressive eyes. "I'm sorry, my girl," he murmured to the image of his daughter. "It seems your father must do one last thing before he can really rest." As the night advanced, Don William meticulously planned his strategy for the following day. He had no illusions. Owens wouldn't come alone despite his promise, and Don William wouldn't either. At 3 in the morning, he made a call to one of the few numbers he remembered by heart. "Charles?" he asked when they answered. "It's William. Foster, I need a favor. The last one, I promise." The man on the other end of the line, Charles the engineer Morrison, former communications and surveillance specialist of his organization, was silent for a few seconds before responding. "Don, William, I thought you were—" "I know, everyone thought so. But I need your help one more time." "Whatever you need, Don William. You saved my life. I owe you everything." Don William smiled slightly. Loyalty was a rare currency in his world, but when you found it, it was invaluable. "Tomorrow, at the Museum of Modern Art. I need eyes everywhere." He explained what he needed, and Charles listened attentively, asking occasional questions. When they finished, Don William felt more confident. With the engineer watching, the Falcon as backup, and some other contacts he planned to activate in the morning, he would be sufficiently prepared for his meeting with Owens. He finally allowed himself to close his eyes, seeking a few hours of rest before dawn. Tomorrow would be a decisive day, not only for him, but for the future of many people in San Francisco. His last thought before sleeping was for Mary. "It's not revenge," he murmured as if she could hear him. "It's correction. One last act to amend a mistake I made many years ago." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in a luxurious mansion in Pacific Heights, Sebastian the Shark Owens turned off his phone with an indecipherable expression. Around him, several of his lieutenants awaited instructions. "What do we do with the old man, boss?" asked one of them, the same one who had received the shot in the hand, now professionally bandaged. Owens contemplated the question while pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a carved crystal glass. "The eagle was the best," he said finally. "He taught me everything I know. He's dangerous even now." "So we eliminate him at the museum?" Owens shook his head. No, that would be disrespectful." He took a sip of whiskey, savoring it. "First, I'll listen to what he has to say. Then we'll decide." But in his eyes there was a calculating gleam that his men knew well. The Shark had already made his decision. Don William Foster, the Eagle, the man who had once controlled San Francisco with an iron hand, would not see the sunset of the following day. The Museum of Modern Art, also known as SF MoMA, sparkled under the midday sun. Its striking contemporary architecture contrasted with the clear sky of San Francisco, creating an almost unreal image. Tourists lined up at the entrance, cameras in hand, unaware of the drama that was about to unfold within its historic walls. Don William arrived 20 minutes before the agreed time. He wore one of his impeccable suits, this one dark gray with an immaculate white shirt and a blue silk tie. At first glance, he looked like just another distinguished visitor, perhaps an academic or an art collector. No one would have suspected that beneath this elegant exterior hid one of the most feared men in the recent history of the city. He bought his ticket and entered the museum with studied calm. In his ear, a tiny earpiece kept him in contact with Charles, who had installed discreet surveillance cameras at strategic points. "All quiet for now, Don William," reported the engineer through the earpiece. "There's a black car parked half a block away, 2 men inside, and another one in the cafe across from the museum. No sign of Owens yet." "Understood," murmured Don William, pretending to examine one of the modern paintings. "Xavier, in position. Second floor next to the window overlooking the courtyard." Don William nodded slightly. He had backup, but he knew he was taking an enormous risk. Sebastian Owens was not a man who forgave easily, and Don William had been the mentor who had abandoned him, who had tried to distance himself from the business that Owens now controlled with an iron hand. As he toured the halls of the museum, genuinely admiring the art and modern installations, Don William reflected on the decisions that had led him to this moment. 20 years ago, after the loss of Mary, he had tried to leave that life behind, disappear with his daughter Catherine, start anew. It had worked, largely. His daughter had grown up away from the violence, had become a respected university professor. He had found certain peace in his anonymity, in the quiet routine of his days. But now here he was risking everything again, for a boy he barely knew, for a moral debt with a past he thought he had buried. Was it worth it? The question resonated in his mind as he observed a particularly intense abstract painting, with its penetrating colors that seemed to judge him from the canvas. "Owen's just arrived," Charles's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Alone, as he promised. Although his men are still in the vehicles and there are 2 more who just entered through the back door." Don William showed no reaction whatsoever. He expected it. Sebastian had never been one to completely keep his word. He headed toward the central courtyard of the museum, an open space surrounded by the striking contemporary walls with an artistic arrangement of sculptures and installations. There, seated on a bench under the shadow of a modern sculpture, was Sebastian Owens. The years had been generous to him. At 50, he maintained an athletic physique, his black hair barely sprinkled with grey at the temples, impeccably combed back. He wore a navy blue Italian-cut suit without a tie, with a silk handkerchief peeking from the upper pocket. Upon seeing Don William approach, a smile drew on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and calculating. "Teacher," he greeted, standing up and extending his hand. "It's a real pleasure to see you after so long." Don William shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip, the ostentatious rings on Owens's fingers. "Sebastian," he responded with a slight nod, "you look good." "Life has been generous," Owens made a gesture for them to sit. "Although not as much as with you from what I see. The years have barely touched you." "Let's not deceive ourselves with courtesies, Sebastian," said Don William, going straight to the point. "We both know why we're here." Owens's smile tensed slightly. "Actually, I don't know. You disappear for 20 years. Everyone thought you were dead or exiled, and suddenly you reappear asking questions about me, scaring my men. It's natural that I'm curious." Don William studied his former protégé, looking in him for the ambitious young man he had taken under his wing. But that young man had disappeared, replaced by this calculating man whose cruelty was rumored to be legendary. "Gabriel Ruiz," Don William said simply. Owen's expression didn't change, but a flash of recognition shone in his eyes. "Who?" "You know perfectly well who he is. A young man who wanted to leave your organization and who your men brutally beat a few days ago." Owens laughed softly as if the mention were trivial. "Don William, I manage a business with hundreds of employees. I can't be aware of every little disciplinary incident. Don't play innocent, Sebastian, it never suited you well." Don William kept his voice low but firm. "The boy is in the hospital, his family terrified, and all because he wanted to distance himself from a life he hadn't chosen." "Businesses have rules," responded Owens, the pretense of kindness gradually fading. "Rules that you yourself taught me. Loyalty is absolute. Whoever breaks that loyalty must face the consequences. I taught you many things, Sebastian, but I never taught you to be a tyrant without honor." The comment seemed to touch a sensitive nerve. Owens visibly tensed, his eyes hardening even more. "Honor?" he repeated with disdain. "You talk to me about honor. You, who abandoned everything, who left your men without leadership, who allowed chaos to take over the territories you had built for decades. What kind of honor is there in that?" Don William remained impassive at the attack. "I lost my wife, Sebastian. I had a daughter to raise, to protect from this world." "And I lost my mentor," responded Owens, a trace of the old wound still perceptible in his voice. "The man who promised he would always be there, who would guide me. Instead, you disappeared without a word, leaving us all wondering if you were alive or dead." For a moment, silence settled between them, only interrupted by the voices of tourists who were enjoying their visit, oblivious to the tense exchange. "I didn't come to discuss the past," Don William finally said. "I came to offer you a deal." Owens arched an eyebrow, intrigued despite his resentment. "A deal? Gabriel Ruiz and his family. You leave them in peace, completely, forever, in exchange." Don William paused, knowing that what he was about to propose would irrevocably change his future. "In exchange, I return." Surprise was genuinely reflected on Owens's face. "You return? What do you mean exactly?" "To the organization. Not as a leader, of course, those days are gone, but as an advisor, as a figure of moral authority, if you will. Someone who can talk with the old bosses, mediate in disputes, smooth tensions. You know, there are still many who respect my name." Owens looked at him fixedly, evaluating the offer, looking for the trap. "Why would you do something like that? For a boy you don't even know?" Don William held his gaze. "Because I did this to him, Sebastian. By training you, by molding what you became, every young man your men recruit, every family threatened, every business extorted. All of that bears my mark, my legacy, and the time has come to correct it." Owens reclined on the bench, considering the words. "A return of the legendary eagle," he murmured, almost to himself. "It would certainly be beneficial in many aspects. The old bosses respect you. The traditional families would look favorably on your presence." "So do we have a deal?" pressed Don William. "Not so fast." Owens raised a hand. "There's a problem with your proposal. How do I know I can trust you? After all, you abandoned me once." "You don't trust me," responded Don William frankly, "as I don't trust you. But we're both businessmen, Sebastian, and this agreement benefits both of us." Owens seemed to reflect deeply. Finally, a calculating smile drew on his face. "Very well, Don William. I accept your offer with one additional condition." "Which would be?" "Your permanent residence in San Francisco. No mysterious disappearances, no retirements to Boston to visit your daughter. If you come back, it's to stay." Don William felt the weight of that condition. It meant giving up the tranquility he had built, the anonymous life he had enjoyed. It meant, possibly, distancing himself even more from Catherine. "I accept," he said finally, "but I also have an additional condition. Jack Miller and his group, the young men from the cafe, they will stop recruiting boys from the neighborhood." Owens made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "They're insignificant pawns. I can do without them." "I didn't say do without them. I said they should stop recruiting young men, give them other responsibilities, less harmful." "As you wish, teacher," responded Owens, a touch of the old deference returning to his voice. He stood up and extended his hand. "So it's a deal." Don William also stood up and shook the offered hand, sealing a pact that would change the course of many lives, including his own. "One more thing," said Owens as he prepared to leave. "Tonight, I have an important dinner at my residence. The main lieutenants will be present. It would be a perfect moment to announce your return." Don William nodded. "I'll be there." "Excellent. I'll send a car for you at 8. Owens made a slight bow of his head, almost reverential. "Until tonight, Don William." As he watched his former protégé walk away, Don William heard a voice in his ear. "All good, Don William?" asked Charles. "Yes. Maintain surveillance until I exit the museum." "You've done the right thing," intervened Xavier's voice. "That boy and his family didn't deserve the fate that awaited them." Don William didn't respond. Inside him, a storm of contradictory emotions struggled to dominate him. Had he done the right thing? Or had he just made the biggest mistake of his life, sealing a pact with a man in whom he could never trust? He walked slowly through the halls of the museum, contemplating the paintings that showed innovation and artistic daring. Artists who had converted their vision into beauty, who had found strength in their vulnerability. Upon leaving the museum, the sun shone intensely over San Francisco. Don William stopped for a moment, observing the bustle of the city he had once controlled, and to which he now returned, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. as a barrier between Owens's unbridled ambition and the innocents who could be affected by it. He took out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Dad?" Catherine's voice sounded surprised. She rarely received calls from her father at that time of day. "Hello, my girl," responded Don William, a softness in his voice that he reserved exclusively for her. "How are you?" "Good, preparing my classes for tomorrow. And you? You sound different." Don William smiled sadly. Catherine had always been perceptive since she was a child. "I'm fine, I just wanted to hear your voice." He paused, considering how much to tell her. "I think I won't be able to visit you this month as we had planned. Some issues have come up here in the city." "Issues?" Catherine's tone became cautious. "What kind of issues, Dad?" Don William closed his eyes for a moment. His daughter knew fragments of his past, but never the complete story. It had been his way of protecting her. "Nothing you should worry about," he responded, opting for evasion. "Just pending matters that I must resolve." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Catherine spoke with a serious voice. "Be careful, Dad, whatever it is, please take good care of yourself." "I always do, my girl, I'll call you soon." Upon hanging up, Don William felt the weight of the decisions taken and those he still had to face. The approaching night would be crucial. He knew Sebastian well enough to know that this important dinner was a test, a carefully prepared, a scenario to evaluate his sincerity, his commitment to the agreement. As he walked toward his car, Don William mentally reviewed the faces and names of those who would probably be present that night. Powerful, dangerous men, many of whom would have been his subordinates in the past. How would they receive him now? As the returned leader or as an uncomfortable ghost of better times? The phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from Richard. "Gabriel woke up. The doctors say he will recover completely. Thank you for everything, Don William." A slight smile drew on Don William's face. At least one life had been saved. A young man would have a second chance away from violence and fear. "For you, Mary," he murmured, looking at the sky. "For the better world you always wanted for our daughter." That night, as he prepared for dinner at Owens's mansion, Don William contemplated his reflection in the mirror. The impeccable black suit, the grey silk tie, the perfectly combed white hair. The image of dignity and power he had always projected. But his eyes told a different story. A story of loss, of sacrifice, and now of redemption. The clock marked 8 o'clock sharp when the doorbell rang. The car sent by Owens had arrived. Don William took the silver rosary that had been Mary's gift and put it in the pocket of his coat, close to his heart. Then, with the determination of one who has accepted his destiny, he went out to face the night that would define the rest of his life. Owens's mansion in Pacific Heights was exactly as Don William had imagined it, ostentatious, excessive, a statement of power more than a home. Armed guards watched discreetly, while butlers with white gloves served champagne in carved crystal glasses. In the great hall, decorated with contemporary art of incalculable value, were gathered the most powerful men of San Francisco's underworld. Some faces were familiar to Don William, old acquaintances who had survived the territorial wars. Others were new, ambitious young men who had risen during his absence. When he entered, an expectant silence seized the place. All eyes turned toward him, some with amazement, others with reverence, a few with poorly disguised misgiving. Sebastian Owens, in the center of the hall, raised his glass. "Gentlemen," he announced, with a clear and powerful voice, "tonight we have among us a legend, the man who built the foundations on which we all now prosper, my mentor, my teacher, Don William, the Eagle, Foster." A murmur ran through the room, followed by a respectful applause. Don William slightly inclined his head in acknowledgement, maintaining his serene and dignified expression. "Don William has decided to return," continued Owens, "not as a competitor, but as an advisor, as the voice of experience and wisdom that we all need in these changing times." He raised his glass even higher. "To Don William Foster, because the Eagle returns to fly over our city." "To Don William," the attendees chorused, drinking to his health. While the conversations resumed and groups formed in different corners of the hall, Owens approached Don William, offering him a glass of champagne. "Everything is going perfectly," he murmured. Only so Don William could hear him. "Your presence has caused exactly the effect I expected. Together we're going to consolidate an empire as this city has never seen." Don William took the glass, but didn't drink. His eyes scanned the room, evaluating, calculating, recognizing old loyalties and new threats. "Don't confuse yourself, Sebastian," he responded in a low voice. "I'm not here to help you build an empire. I'm here to make sure your ambition doesn't destroy more innocent lives." Owens's smile faltered for an instant, but he quickly regained his composure. "Always so idealistic, teacher. Time will teach you that in our world, the end justifies the means. And time will teach you, my former apprentice, that some prices are too high even for absolute power." Their gazes crossed in a silent duel of wills. Two men, teacher and student, now facing each other on a new board where the rules had changed, but the game remained the same. A game of power, of honor, and of blood. The challenge had just begun. Don William knew that the days and months to come would be a constant test of his determination, of his cunning, and of his ability to remain true to his purpose. To protect the innocent, to honor Mary's memory, and perhaps finally redeem the dark legacy he had left behind 20 years ago. Because although the eagle had returned to fly over San Francisco, this time he did so not as a predator, but as a guardian. And in the silence of his heart, Don William Foster promised himself that whatever happened, this time he would do things differently. This time the past would not only whisper in his ears, it would also illuminate his path toward redemption. Dear listeners, we hope that Don William Foster's story has moved you and captured your imagination. The Return of the Eagle shows us that it's never too late to face our past and seek redemption. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special list with equally captivating stories about honor, family, and second chances. Find it here by clicking to your left. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life in America and beyond. Your comments are our greatest inspiration, so don't hesitate to share your thoughts about Don William's fate and what you think will happen in his new life as guardian of the city. We await you in the comments.